Now let's get to work. Next is a series of exercises for practicing Section 2-207 problems. Before we begin, get your supplement or other copy of 2-207 handy. Ignore subpart 2 for now. We're learning only subparts 1 and 3. Finally, do think about these problems yourself. If you're just an observer, you'll get nothing from this. The answer is yes, the forms establish a contract. The first document was buyer's offer because the statement of facts says so. We need an acceptance. Is the seller's acknowledgement form an acceptance? Yes. It said its purpose was to acknowledge buyer's purchase, suggesting a done deal. What about the fact that the acknowledgement form stated a different choice of form? This is a contract for sale of goods, so 2-207 applies. The strict mirror image rule is gone. The acknowledgement's different choice of form clause will not prevent the acknowledgement from serving as an acceptance. Thus, the offer and acknowledgement establish a contract. The contract is based on the offer and the offer's terms, including the Texas choice of form. What about the seller's choice of form? It's just a proposal. It can't become part of a contract unless it succeeds under subpart 2, which is a topic for the next lecture. Incidentally, we'll use choice of form or choice of law clauses in a lot of our exercises going forward because these are classic fine print terms. They're exactly the sort of thing about which forms will be in conflict. A choice of form clause is a way of limiting the places where the other party can file a lawsuit. You'd rather the lawsuit be in your backyard or your favorite court system. Here's problem number 2. The answer is no, the forms do not establish a contract. The seller's form is designed to be a counteroffer. It doesn't say the offer is rejected. It doesn't say this is a counteroffer, but it does state a clear equivalent. Our agreement is conditional on your signing and returning this form, assenting to the terms of this form. The seller used a form it hoped would assure that any contract would be based on the seller's terms. At this point, we don't yet have a contract. What the parties do next will determine whether there's a contract and what terms will govern the contract. One possibility is that the buyer will accept the seller's counteroffer by signing and returning the seller's form. Then the parties will have a contract based on the seller's form. But let's account for human beings who haven't been to law school. Sellers' office workers aren't diligent in making sure buyers follow through with the command that they must sign and return seller's form. They're dealing with lots of sales and tons of paperwork. Also, seller needs to pay rent and to meet payroll, and there's a lot of pressure to get sales done as fast as possible. And of course, the seller's staff doesn't understand the significance of the condition in the seller's form. So they ship the goods and invoice for immediate payment. What just happened for contract law purposes? First, if the buyer pays for the goods and doesn't reject them, the parties' mutual assent to a contract is established by their performance. What are the terms? Under the common law, we might have said the last shot rule. The last form wins. That's the seller's acknowledgement. But this is a sale of goods, and Section 2-207 subpart 3 applies. The last shot rule is dead. If the contract isn't established by the documents, the terms are only those about which the parties' forms agree. Put the offer and acknowledgement counteroffer side by side and look for terms the forms have in common. Everything else is eliminated. What about the choice of form clauses in the parties' forms? They contradict each other, so there's no agreement on choice of form. If buyer sues for breach of warranty, where can buyer file suit? Anywhere buyer can find jurisdiction and venue, just as you've learned now in civil procedure. Now let's move on. Here's problem number 3. The answer is yes, there is a contract. The contract has no choice of form clause. Why is there a contract? That's the easy part. The first sentence of the problem is, buyer and seller reached an oral agreement. By this time, you know that a contract can be oral. The facts say that the parties made their contract before either party sent a form. Why did the parties send forms if they already had a contract? Each side wanted to create a written record of the contract. Each side wanted to be sure to satisfy the statute of frauds, a topic for the future. And each side was hoping it could slip its own terms into the contract. An important lesson from this problem is that a contract can exist even before the first form or other writing. Now we don't need an acceptance. The function of any form that follows the formation of a contract can only be to confirm and record a contract. What about the addition or different terms the parties included in their forms, especially the choice of form clauses? We're going to assume that the oral agreement did not include much discussion about incidental terms like choice of form, so the contract lacked a choice of form. Did either party's confirmation add a choice of law clause for the contract? The general rule is that neither party can unilaterally add to or change a term in an existing contract. Things are actually a little more complicated under Section 2-207, Subpart 2, but we'll get to that later. For present purposes, let's just say there is a contract. Both parties proposed their own choice of form, but the parties plainly disagreed about a choice of form, so they have no choice of form clause. Now here's problem number 4. The answer is no. There is no contract. And if there's no contract, buyer could not have breached the contract. This problem provides an example of a form that is not an expression of acceptance, even though it's not expressly conditional on the other party's assent and doesn't say counteroffer or rejected. In fact, it wouldn't matter if it said seller accepts. Why? Because it's different as to an essential term, quantity. Section 2-207 was designed to deal with conflicts between standardized forms, not a proposal of essential terms to a contract. To put it another way, you don't express acceptance if you change what will be delivered, how much will be delivered, or what the price the buyer will pay. The parties have to agree on these things to have a contract. Let's synthesize what we've learned so far. The first 4 problems suggest a process for evaluating a Section 2-207 problem for a sale of goods. First, decide whether a contract already existed when either or both parties sent a form. If the parties already had a prior oral or informal contract, any form that followed could only confirm the contract. An acceptance wasn't needed. A counteroffer would have been useless because a counteroffer can't undo an existing contract. Second, if a form was preceded by and responded to an offer and it expresses acceptance, its additional or different terms won't defeat its effect as acceptance unless it's expressly conditional or otherwise clearly intended to be a counteroffer, or it states essential terms different from the other. Of course, if it's A or B, it's a counteroffer. Now we're ready for our 5th problem. Here's the answer. The answer is the parties had no contract until they performed by delivery and payment, manifesting assent to a contract by their performance. The original offer, the buyer's purchase order, was followed by an acknowledgement that was expressly conditional on buyer's assent to different terms. The acknowledgement was not an acceptance, it was a counteroffer. Buyer never responded to that counteroffer. Nevertheless, the parties manifested their assent to a contract by their performance. Here's another question based on problem 5. Here's the answer. The answer is yes. The contract had a choice of forum clause selecting Texas. How could the parties have a choice of forum clause if neither party accepted the other party's form? Remember Section 2-207 subpart 3. If the parties' documents fail to establish a contract, but their performance manifests mutual assent to a contract, the terms are those about which the parties' forms agree. Buyer's form and seller's form both agree about at least one thing. The choice of forum is Texas. Here's the last question based on problem 5. Here's the answer. The answer is no. The parties' contract did not include an arbitration clause. One party's form had that clause, the other party's form did not. They did not agree on arbitration. Finally, we're ready for our principal case for this lecture, Dorton versus Collins and Eichmann. The disputed clause was an arbitration provision in a seller's standardized acknowledgement. Did the arbitration provision become part of the contract? That question is important because the buyer, having accepted delivery of many shipments of carpets for its retail business, sued for breach of warranty. If the arbitration clause was part of the contract, the buyer wasn't allowed to sue in court. It was required to arbitrate. Another way to put the issue is whether the seller's acknowledgement was the document on which the contract was based. For this to be true, the acknowledgement must have served as an offer, because an acceptance or a confirmation can't establish the terms of a contract. If the acknowledgement was not an offer that was accepted, the arbitration clause was nothing more than a proposal. So let's advance into this battle of the forms. By now, you should be able to see that any form in a battle of the forms can have one of 4 different functions. Number 1, offer. Number 2, acceptance. Number 3, counteroffer. Or number 4, confirmation. Identifying whether the form in forms can have arbitration clause was nothing more than a proposal. So let's advance into this battle of the forms. By now, you should be able to see that any form in a battle of the forms can have one of 4 different functions. Number 1, offer. Number 2, acceptance. Number 3, counteroffer. Or number 4, confirmation. Identifying whether the form in question is one thing or another is often decisive. Under Section 2-207, only an offer that is accepted establishes terms of a contract. The terms in any other form are at best proposals to modify the contract. As we'll see later, proposals to modify nearly always fail in a 2-207 battle of the forms. To determine whether the seller's acknowledgement was one thing and not another, we have to look at what preceded the acknowledgement. Was this acknowledgement form the beginning of offer and acceptance so that this acknowledgement was the offer? Or did the other party previously make an oral or written offer so that the acknowledgement might be an acceptance or possibly a counteroffer? And finally, had the parties already reached a contract, possibly an oral agreement, so that the acknowledgement could only be a confirmation? An extra complexity in Dorton lies in the fact that the lawsuit concerned 55 repeat transactions and 55 contracts between a buyer and its regular supplier. The answers to our questions might be different for every contract. First possibility, parties had already reached an oral contract. This might have happened in conversations between the parties' representatives at the buyer's office or in phone calls between the buyer and the seller. If this is true, the outcome is simple. Once a contract forms, any form that follows is a confirmation that can only propose changes, and proposals will often fail to become part of a contract. We'll say more about proposals in the next lecture. If the parties had a contract before the seller's acknowledgement, the seller's arbitration clause is nothing but a proposal. However, it's possible, the court said, that the oral contracts agreed to arbitration, and the trial court will have to make findings on this point on remand. It's unlikely that oral contracts included arbitration, but not absolutely impossible. Now let's tackle the second possibility. The buyer made an oral offer before the seller's acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was either an acceptance or a counteroffer. It matters whether the form was an acceptance or a counteroffer, because an acceptance completes a contract but can only propose changes, while a counteroffer is a new offer that might establish the terms of a contract if it's accepted. Could the acknowledgement be an acceptance? Does it express acceptance despite its fine print? Apparently, yes. Here are 4 relevant facts. The form was always in response to a particular order offer by the buyer. There were different versions of the form, which leads us to B. Sometimes the form was titled contract, as if it made a final contract the way acceptance does. No matter what version the seller used, C, the form always restated the essential terms of the buyer's offer. And finally, D, the different terms were just the usual standardized fine print. If the form was an acceptance, the arbitration clause was just a proposal that likely failed to become part of a contract, for reasons that we'll discuss in the next lecture. Could the acknowledgement have been a counteroffer? It's not enough to be a counteroffer that the form violated the strict version of the mirror image rule. It would have to be clear that the form was a counteroffer, and that the form rejected the offer, or that a contract was conditional on the buyer's assent to the seller's terms. This form was not a counteroffer. It had lots of additional fine print, but that's not enough. Here are some reasons. A, it didn't say counteroffer. B, it didn't say offer rejected. C, it didn't change an essential term. And D, it didn't make a contract conditional on the buyer's assent to the seller's terms. The seller argued that the form did require the buyer's assent to the seller's term. But this argument failed. The seller's form said essentially, if we don't hear from you at all, your silence will manifest assent to our terms. Does that remind you of a problem we've discussed before? Yes, an offer can't impose a rule that silence is acceptance. To make a contract conditional on the other party's assent, a form has to demand an express version of assent, such as signing and returning a copy of the form. That never happened here. The court held that the seller's form, by failing to be a counteroffer, became an acceptance of the buyer's terms. The resulting contract was based on the buyer's oral offer and probably did not include arbitration, except in the unlikely event the offer mentioned arbitration. That's all for now, except I'll leave you with a question. If the arbitration clause was just a proposal, could that proposal have become part of a contract under 2-207 subpart 2? That's one of the main topics for the next lecture, when I'll also describe another weird contract phenomenon you might have experienced in your own life as a consumer, a rolling contract.